Sometimes life throws you a curveball. Sometimes the world around you gives you more than you think you can handle. But guess what? Nature is made to survive. Animals, including us, can survive amazingly harsh conditions. Never say never. Here are some animals that have learned and evolved to adapt to some of the worst conditions in the world. If you want to see some of the weirdest looking animals on the planet, look at the bottom of the ocean. Some of the animals that are down there are so bizarre that humans didn't believe they ever existed. They were thought to be mythological. Some of them are so bizarre that some humans still don't believe that they exist. Now, when you live in such an extreme temperature, extreme cold, and the massive amount of pressure that is put on you from miles of water above you, and the mountain ranges that are under the water, volcanoes, earthquakes underwater, it's extremely difficult to adapt to such an environment. And for a long time, people didn't believe anything could live at the very bottom of the deepest part of the ocean, such as the Marianas Trench. Now we know different. We know that there are quite a few different animals down there, and some of them have adapted in very interesting ways. So how do you survive in the deep sea? How do you survive in an amount of pressure heavy enough to crush bones? Well, I guess it helps if you don't have bones, like this guy. This is a blobfish. Yes, that is its real name, not a nickname. Actual scientists decided that the best name for this species was blobfish. These guys obtained some internet fame when they were first found, and they are still today widely known as the ugliest fish in the world. They do look a lot less ugly when they're actually in the water. The first documentation of them had them sitting outside of the water, and they kind of deflated. Their lack of bones is what causes them to basically deflate when they're out of the water, looking a great deal uglier than they normally do. But they do keep that derpy little face. Blobfish have no bones and barely any muscle tone. They don't really swim, they just kind of float about, barely above the seafloor, like a blob. They hunt similarly to a jellyfish. They sort of drift along and wait for things to float near enough to them to slurp them up. They rely very heavily on other animals running into them. We honestly don't know much about them because they are very difficult to find and study alive. Most documentation of them is after they've been caught by fishermen, and they're not usually alive at that point. However, fairly recently, one was actually caught alive in Japan and is now being kept in an aquarium there. His name is Bob the Blobfish. They are believed to be extremely endangered. But as with many deep-sea creatures, we don't really know for sure because they're so difficult to find. They may not be endangered, they may just be very elusive to us. Another way to survive the extreme pressure underwater is to be able to stretch yourself out. Sort of like in a circus or performance where someone lays on a bed of nails, if you've ever seen something like that. How they do that is they stretch out and distribute their weight evenly over those nails so that they're not actually putting 100 to 200 pounds of weight onto a single nail. Now, the wider that you are underwater, the larger that you are, the easier it is for you to distribute that pressure. So, a great example of that is this guy. This is a Japanese spider crab. Now, he basically just kind of looks like a long crab, right? He doesn't look that crazy. However, believe it or not, these guys get to be over 12 feet long. That means that they can sit on top of a car and touch all of their legs down to the pavement. That's insane. That's a huge animal. They can weigh up to 50 pounds. When you see their maximum size, they look like they'd be terrifying or dangerous, right? They're really not. They're scavengers rather than hunters, and they're actually very gentle. They don't really hunt very well, and they're even a bit clumsy. When they're in captivity, they get along well with almost any other species because despite their large size, they pretty much just keep to themselves and don't get into any fights. They change environments and tank mates easily and seem to be pretty uncaring, and they basically just mind their own business. They just go with the flow and bumble very clumsily about. They basically couldn't hurt a human being. Scientists have described them as slow, clumsy, and stupid, but that hasn't stopped them from surviving a very long time. In fact, they can live over 100 years at the bottom of the ocean, and only at the bottom because they don't actually swim. They just walk around on the bottom. This isn't a crab that you're likely to find in a restaurant, though it is possible in some places, especially in Japan. They're seen as a delicacy and cost a lot of money, which makes sense considering how difficult they are to find. Not only are they pretty few and far between, but they are very, very deep down in the water. Like many crabs, despite the fact that they have that super hard shell, the way that they get to be so big is by shedding that shell. Kind of like a snake sheds its skin. When it gets to be too big, it kind of pulls all of its little legs inside and then pushes itself out of the shell. Now, very rarely do these actually have a fully intact shell when they're done, because as they're kind of maneuvering and pulling themselves around, kind of like if you were in a pair of pants that are much, much, much too small for you, if you start wiggling about, you're probably going to tear a seam, right? So most often, that shell ends up being broken and shattered when they're done. But if you want to see a completely formed shell that's about 3 feet wide, you can go to the Sea Life Aquarium at the Mall of America, and on their behind the scenes tour, they actually have one of those crab shells on the wall, because for a while we had one right here in Minnesota. One thing that we think of the most when we think of the very, very bottom of the ocean is that it's deep and dark, right? And it's dark enough that it is completely pitch black. So there's a lot of species that either don't see at all or only see bits of shadows. So when there's a bit of light, they get drawn to it. So bioluminescence, which is when an animal can create its own light, is very, very valuable in such an area. This serves many purposes, but one of the most known reasons for it is for hunting. Anglerfish live in a place where not many other things can survive. So, if they want to hunt in a place with very little prey, they need to have the ability to bring their prey to them. And they do. The light that they can create draws other fish to them. Then, using their massive mouth, they gulp them down. Most often in one bite. That's like if your parents gave you a great big cheeseburger and you swallowed it whole. That's pretty impressive. They create the light because of a symbiotic relationship. They actually can't do it on their own. So a symbiotic relationship means that there's two different species that survive by helping each other. There's a bacteria that glows if it's exposed to a very specific chemical. The anglerfish can create that chemical. Neither of them can glow without working together. So when the bacteria grows on the anglerfish, they have the ability to create that glow. So they can't find food without working together. Now, one interesting thing about anglerfish is kind of similar to lions. Some of you might already know that male lions don't usually hunt. The females hunt. That's true of anglerfish too. Now, the reason for this is mostly because the males are teeny tiny and the females are much, 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 much bigger. So the males basically hang on to the female and the female just feeds them. They are completely supported by her. Females can be up to 110 pounds and 3 feet long.